Hi, everybody. Uh, if you guys remember last time we talked in class, uh, we left off with a slide similar to this. We got into smog and inversions and things, but I told you guys I would come back to this slide right here and explain why the NO concentration was increasing before the NO2. And I came up with an answer after talking to some people from NIMSY and a couple other teachers that I know. The reason why we see the NO curve and the NO2 curve be almost identical, but the NO kind of maximizes a little bit before the NO2 is that these are that family of compounds called NOx. So when the cars and diesel trucks are burning their fuel, they're producing those NOx emissions. So they're not only producing the NO2, they're also producing a smaller amount of NO. And it's especially, it's produced even more whenever the cars are not warmed up. So it takes a little bit of time before the engines start working to 100% efficiency. With gasoline powered cars, the engines work almost in that perfect stoichiometric ratio where they're burning up all the gasoline because there's a perfect amount of oxygen being put in. Now with diesel engines, there's an excess of oxygen, so they tend to produce a little more of these NOx compounds the entire time that they're running. With the gasoline powered cars though, they're really only producing those NO2s later on once the cars are warmed up. But before they're warmed up, they're also releasing the NO. So coming out of the engine, again, if this is our engine here, and then we have the exhaust system, in gasoline powered cars, we have the catalytic converter first, and then we go into the muffler and then the tailpipe. Again, the muffler does nothing for the emissions, only the catalytic converter reduces emissions. So as that NO2 and NO goes into that catalytic converter, it's reacted by those catalysts in the presence of high heat to convert into N2. The oxygen parts of those compounds are then used to react the carbon monoxide to form carbon dioxide and clean up the hydrocarbons and other things that are emitted. So that's the reason why this NO peaks out a little bit before the NO2. The engines aren't warmed yet, and both compounds are being produced. When the engines are cooler, more NO is being produced than NO2. Once the engines warm up, then we have more NO2 being produced. Once the complete system is warmed up, though, that's where we start reducing those compounds down considerably, and we see that towards like the end of rush hour, usually around the peak of rush hour, those compounds peak out, and then they start to be reduced afterwards. It's not that the engines aren't producing them, they're producing them still, it's just that the catalytic converters are cleaning them up afterwards. So into the new stuff then. We talked about the inversions, we talked about all the other stuff. The part that we left off on was particulate matter. And it's important to note that particulate matter is not only smoke. It does include the smoke, but it's also going to include a lot of other things. Smoke is going to be the primary particulate matter pollutant we worry about. But we also have things like dust, pollen, any of those types of things out there. So with the soil particles, we're talking about dust here. And that's either dust produced on the job site, like they're doing the construction project out at Sloan School. We've had a lot of rain lately, but let's say that we went for a month without rain. Now all that soil is going to be dry and kind of compacted. As the trucks are riding over, it's going to kick up dust. If you've walked through the grass at school during the really, really dry times, your feet get covered up in pollen and dust and all those things. Those are all parts of particulate matter, whether it's the smaller 2.5 or the bigger 10. And again, the number associated with it is the size of the microns associated. PM10 is anything 10 microns or larger. Anything between 2.5 and 10 rather. And then particulate matter 2.5 is anything less than 2.5 micrometers. And again, a micron is a micrometer, 10 to the minus 6 meters. So we have all of these different things that can be included into it. When we talk about really problemsome ones, it's going to be the lead and asbestos. The lead can come from paints that we used, really prior to the 1980s. The EPA has that as a criteria pollutant now. So we're not allowed using it in paints any longer. But prior to the 1980s, they used it not only as the white pigment in paint, but they also used it to help the paint adhere to the walls as well. So that's why if you've ever heard jokes about, oh, you must have eaten paint as a kid, that's why they're saying that. Uh, Lead in the paint is a neurologic disruptor. It causes cognitive developmental problems where you're not developing cognitively like you should. You end up having lower IQs, neurologic problems, all those things. So it's a terrible joke to make that people, my age and older tend to make because that's what we grew up with. Kids put anything that they can in their mouth. So whenever they're sitting around, if the paint is chipping off the wall, they're going to sit there and eat it. Or prior to the 1980s, we used lead paint in a lot of toys because the toys are painted cheaply. The lead paints were cheaper than the higher end paints. So, kids would put their toy in their mouth, and next thing you know, they're exposed to lead. You still hear a lot of recalls on the news uh, for toys a lot of times, and a lot of times it's due to the paint because in America we have the EPA that regulates those criteria pollutants, but in other countries they don't have those restrictions. China is especially problemsome because most of our cheaper toys are made in China now. China doesn't have those lead restrictions, so they tend to use lead-based paints. When those products make their way into America, the EPA tests them, and if they find that they contain the lead-based paints, then they immediately have to be recalled and nobody can use those or sell those anymore. Asbestos is another big one. This was used primarily in insulations. And the reason why it was used, it was great at absorbing heat. It didn't allow the pipes to cool down. It didn't allow heat to enter into certain systems. They used it a lot of it, excuse me, a lot in industry, but they also used it in commercial buildings, homes. To a point, there was asbestos. A lot of times, it was actually in floor tiles and in homes that were built in the 40s. They had insulation up in the ceilings and in the walls that contained asbestos. If you ever watch home renovation shows, a lot of times the older homes they work on, they actually have to take the asbestos out of the homes, whether it's in the flooring or whether it's in the insulation. We no longer use that in America either. That's another one that's banned for use, but it's still out there extensively. Pretty much any renovation of a building that was built, in the 1950s or 60s is going to have asbestos-based products in them. So the reason why these are problems, again, lead is going to be a neurologic disruptor. Asbestos is a cancer causer. If you've ever seen the lawyer commercials about mesothelioma and certain lung cancers, those are due to the exposure of asbestos. A lot of people that work factory jobs were exposed to this in large quantities because it was in the insulation. As machines were moving around, it would break that insulation up, put those particles in the sky, and then people would breathe them in. As they breathe them in, they would get trapped in their lungs. They're carcinogenic, so the longer they're in their lungs for, the more chances they have to develop lung cancer out of it. So when we look at the particulate matter too, or sorry, any indoor air pollutant, this could be particulate matter or anything really. We're looking at both natural and anthropogenic forms of it. The natural ones are going to be radon, mold, and dust. These are the big ones. The mold and the dust would be particulate matter. Radon's a little bit different. It's not considered to be particulate matter. It's just a indoor air pollutant. We'll get more into radon here in a second. But in any moist environment, you have a leaky window or your gutters aren't working properly and water's going under the roof, making the walls wet. It doesn't even have to be where you see the water coming in the home. It just has to be a moist environment, high humidity environment. That mold starts to grow terribly bad, and the spores from the mold then start to go up in the sky. You breathe those in, and you have higher rates of bronchitis, bacterial infections, higher rates of pneumonia, all those things. Dust is another big one. Again, even just around your house, I'm sure everybody has sat down on the couch and on a sunny day, you see the dust particles floating through the sky. That dust, you don't think about it being a big problem, but again, it's a lung irritant. Any of these are going to be lung irritants, mold, dust, any of the particulate matters. The anthropogenic, again, hopefully you remember, anthropogenic means human caused. These ones are the natural ones that are produced, without human involvement whatsoever. The anthropogenic ones, though, those are the ones that we put there. It's the insulation we use, whether it's asbestos-based insulation, or if it's just fiberglass insulation. Both of those are going to have really fine particles associated with them. As they break down, as we start moving them around, those particles go up in the sky, and we start breathing those in. We talked about VOCs earlier. VOCs were used extensively in furniture, paneling, and carpets, and mainly as fire retardants. meaning they helped things not be as flammable. So, they would spray them down with these fire retardants. The VOCs in those fire retardants would help all the solvents evaporate away and leave that fire retardant on the fabric. So if you have curtains or blinds, couches, you know, non-hardwood based flooring, all those things, the VOCs were used to help either adhere the stain or the color, or they were help to, make it more fire preventative. Another one we have a lot of is formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is embalming fluid. They used to use it when humans died. It helped to preserve the body so you could have viewings and things like that. With the formaldehyde, though, again, it's a carcinogen. They know that it causes cancer. The people who breathe that in high amounts are really, really susceptible to forms of cancer. We used to use that extensively in furniture, upholstery, and carpets as well. That was one of those compounds we used to treat the fabrics to make them stain resistant or fire retardant, all those different things. We still see that out there, and it's usually in the cheaper varieties of those products. So the cheaper furniture you buy, the cheaper carpeting you buy, all those tend to be higher in formaldehyde because it's a really, really good preservative. It's a really good, you know, uh, compound to use when you're doing stain resistance and all those things. One of the big parts that we saw formaldehyde was after Hurricane Katrina. After Hurricane Katrina, the government had FEMA bring a bunch of trailers down to help the displaced people from Hurricane Katrina who lost homes and didn't have anywhere to stay. These FEMA trailers were a godsend for these people because they were homeless at the time. They didn't have a home. Their home was completely destroyed. But within days of moving into their house, as the temperature got warmer, that formaldehyde in the carpet started to evaporate out. They went from living in a decent sized house to being compressed down into maybe a 50 square foot trailer. And that trailer had subpar carpeting in it because they were trying to build them as quickly and as cheaply as possible. Those formaldehyde containing compounds started to vent that formaldehyde up into the atmosphere. It was trapped within the trailers. People were complaining about the smells, being dizzy, having headaches, and they ended up tracing it back to the carpeting. So not only were the people homeless because of Hurricane Katrina, but then the trailers that they were given by FEMA, they ended up becoming homeless a second time because it wasn't safe for them to live in there. All right. The third type of indoor air pollutant is combustion-based pollutants. That's where we see carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and the big one in the developed world is tobacco smoke. And even in the less developed world, but the less economically developed countries have more problems with carbon monoxide and particulate matter and all those things. We tend to really have problems with tobacco smoke and carbon monoxide. In the more economically developed world first, the countries that have thriving economies. The carbon monoxide usually comes from uh, not inefficient burning furnaces, but non-functional or improperly functioning furnaces. So, your furnace down in the basement, you're using that to heat your home. It's burning natural gas usually. If something's happening where it's not getting enough oxygen into the system, again, combustion reactions should have CO2 and water being their only byproducts. And especially with natural gas, because there's not many impurities within it. So usually if natural gas is burnt with an abundance of oxygen, it's going to produce only carbon dioxide and water. But say that something happened to that furnace and it's not venting properly, or it's not drawing in enough air into the system. Now, instead of carbon dioxide being produced, we also have carbon monoxide being produced because we don't have enough oxygen to fully convert those hydrocarbons into carbon dioxide. That carbon monoxide is problematic because our red blood cells have hemoglobin in them, and the hemoglobin is where the oxygen bonds to. So the oxygen we're breathing in binds the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. That's what carries it to our organs and tissues so that we can function. If that carbon monoxide level increases too much and we breathe too much into it, instead of oxygen bonding to the hemoglobin, now carbon monoxide bonds to it. It readily bonds the hemoglobin and blocks the oxygen from getting into your blood. So you could be breathing in more than enough oxygen, but your body's not able to absorb it because of the fact that carbon monoxide is already taking up that space. So people will start getting headaches, they'll start getting dizzy, disoriented. They'll think, oh my, I have a terrible headache, so I need to lay down for a little bit. So they lay down, they're continually breathing in that carbon monoxide, and then they end up passing out and dying from it of asphyxiation, where they don't have enough oxygen coming in. In the less economically developed world, now it's not going to be from heaters so much, but it's going to be from the open pit fires that they have. Or uh, if they don't have open pit fires and they're lucky enough to have a stove in their house, a lot of times their stoves aren't vented to the outside. So it's only taking oxygen in from the room. Once the oxygen level in the room goes down, now it's producing carbon monoxide and putting that out into the sky. With the carbon monoxide, again, uh, you hear, hopefully people know not to, when they go camping in their tents, they know not to bring grills inside and grill out inside the tent, or put space heaters inside of confined spaces, because those space heaters and the grills are converting the hydrocarbons into carbon monoxide. Charcoal grills and wood grills are extremely inefficient in how they burn. So there's a huge amount of carbon monoxide being produced. If you're in a closed and confined space like a tent, you're drastically increasing your chance of asphyxiation because the carbon monoxide is being produced and it's binding to your hemoglobin. So I think we're going to stop there with this video, and I'll pick up and end the unit here in a second with our next one.